Hi, as most of you know, I think maybe I haven't met one or two of you. I'm Richard Boyassas. I'm a professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, although I live in Boston, which is why the photograph behind me. So most of us know each other. We've met at various Academy of Management meetings or PSYOP or URAM, occasionally some of the specialty meetings that LEC has done on coaching and others. Quite a few of us serve on the boards, editorial boards of some of the very same journals. One that's doing a lot of publications is Joel is very active as an associate editor of Consulting Psychology Journal, doing a lot of publishing around coaching research. So to some extent, when TLI was created as one of the 6 separate companies within the ICF umbrella, the idea was for us to look to the future. And although the foundation is doing work in ways of applying coaching in many ways and looking at social change, it was a very creative endeavor on the part of ICF to say, you know, why don't we get a group of people together who can start getting us all to be thinking about not just the current, but what do we know? And as we kind of looked at it, we launched the first convening on the future of work last spring. And we thought it was very appropriate that the second convening be on the future of coaching. And we're saying the future of coaching, but to be honest, a part of what we're trying to do is backing and filling in terms of just establishing the intellectual integrity of the foundations for what we do in practice. Coaching as a field, like many applied areas that people like, ends up very often in practice moving a lot faster than the science can support it, behind it. So part of our job is to both look to the future as to what can make this a stronger worldwide practice, what can enhance both the effectiveness and the applicability of coaching, but also to say, what do we need to do research on to make sure that what we're doing now isn't just a fad, but in fact has some empirical validity behind it and across different cultures and groups of people. So as we thought about it, we decided, you know, except for these occasional symposium at AOM or PSYOP or URAM, we don't really have an opportunity for the researchers to get together. I mean, occasionally at each of the university research centers, we'll have guest speakers, but nothing of a bunch of us. John Bennett, you brought together the various coaching organizations a few years ago to do a meeting on the state of the field of coaching. And certainly Carol, you and Margaret and Susan at the IOC bring people together annually to look at this. And ICF does as well. So the idea, though, for this meeting is that this is season 1, episode 1, for those of you busy streaming your Netflix or Apple TV. And I don't think we'll have as exciting humor as Ted Lasso, but let's hope we make it. So we'll have 3 episodes this season, today, a week from today, and then a week after that. And we varied the times to try to make it easier on people from all over the world. So Michael and the folks in Sydney and Francis and the folks in Malaysia and India and parts of China don't have to end up getting up in the middle of the night to be able to attend. So I know it may be a little inconvenient. Actually, if we handle the time zone thing properly, everybody should feel inconvenient, at least at one of the sessions. So what are we hoping to get out of these 3 conversations? Ideas. Part of it is a chance. And we decided to use this format where we'd have a few presentations, not everybody who's done research, because everybody that was on the original invited list, which includes all of you, of 49 people, are people who, except for the people from some of the ICF organizations, are people who have published research and scholarly work on coaching. And for a number of you, we're thinking about the themes for next year's season 2, if you will, of the future of coaching and particular topics. But what we decided to do is to focus today on the processes and mechanisms of coaching. What is it that makes coaching effective or has an impact? How does it happen? Then next week's session on September 8th, we'll look at what are the desired outcomes. I mean, for those of us doing the research studies, we're always advising our doctoral students or each other around what kind of dependent variables to have. Well, let's have a healthy discussion about that, because I don't think we've been kind of attacking it as broadly as possibly we should, but we'll take a look at that. And then in the third session on September 15th, we'll take a look at what are we learning so far and what do we need to know about coaching for particular groups. Are there differences when coaching women? Are there differences when coaching people from various ethnic groups, races, cultural backgrounds, religious orientation? And in the process, I think start to build a better sense of the foundations. We're looking for 2 specific outcomes and one that we're hoping for. The 2 specific outcomes is that I will be leading the effort with Alicia, Sharon, and the board of TLI to put what we're saying and the ideas that are brought forth from these 3 sessions into a white paper that we will then write and distribute after the session. Hopefully, it can generate enough ideas and specific recommendations of both studies, measures, variables, and samples, that it can be a guide for doctoral students when somebody comes up to you and says, I'd like to do my research or my thesis on coaching, where should I start? And this way we have a little bit of, not coordination, but yeah, in a sense, coordination, more in the spirit of collaboration as to what some of those places should be. The second thing is we're planning to edit the videos of the presentations and and the video from the discussions, the plenary discussions, not the breakout rooms, into a set of not too long videos, and have those posted on our website and available for each of us to be able to use, both watch and use in our classes and in some of our meetings. The thing that we're hoping for is that by the exchange of these ideas, we will start to foster more direct collaboration, that we'll start to see studies being done by groups of us, not just people from one institution or one research lab, but in fact, several people from several places, not only knowing what each other's doing, maybe asking each other for help around, certain measures or definition or operationalization of certain variables, but actually working on some projects together. So that's the overall layout. I'd like to get quickly to it so we can make sure we protect as much time as possible for the actual discussion. So today we're going to kick off with Melvin Smith from Case Western Reserve University, and then have Michael Cavanagh from the University of Sydney. And the third presenter will be Angela Passarelli from the College of Charleston. I'm not going to introduce everybody, but pretty much everybody knows each other, and we know each other from our various articles and book chapters and books. So Melvin, why don't you kick it off?
Great. Thank you, Richard. And hello, everyone, and welcome. This is a thrill to be a part of this group. And I'm looking forward to not only today, but for the series of 3 sessions and episode or season 1, as Richard described it, as well as season 2 and beyond. So I'll try to be quick here today, but by way of introduction to what I'm going to try to do here, in preparing for this session, I was really kind of torn between trying to offer kind of a TED Talk-like presentation. It was mentioned in the initial invite. I was like, okay, wow, I'm putting together a TED Talk for this group. And that didn't quite sound right. So I said, no, that's not it. or is putting together traditional academic research presentation, but given the nature of what we're trying to do here, that didn't feel quite right either. So where I landed was on something kind of in between that's neither of the above, and as a result may meet no one's expectations, but it's what I put together and hopefully it'll serve some value. And I will say that I'm largely, hopefully in this session or in my presentation, setting some context and not going as deep on some things in terms of some of the specific empirical research studies as I might otherwise, because I know that following me today is going to be Angie Passarelli, who will go deeper on some of the specific studies that I'll be alluding to at a high level. Now, we really all know in this area, in this field, that people often struggle to make sustained change in their lives. It's hard, right? Hence the role and utility of coaching. We know coaches play a key role in helping people do just that. And we each, drawing on the various definitions in the field, have our own way that we describe or define coaching. Well, we tend to describe it or define it as a facilitative or helping relationship with the purpose of achieving some type of change, learning, or new level of individual or organizational performance. Right? Well, the question then becomes, just how then do coaches help others change in sustained ways? How does it happen? So as Richard framed this topic for today, we're really going to be thinking about the process and the mechanisms of coaching. Well, when you look at the ICF definition of coaching, ICF defines coaching as partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process, right, that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Now, other credentialing bodies, CCE, WABC, EMCC, and others have offered, perhaps slightly different definitions of what coaching is, but certainly very similar definitions. Well, back in 2012, Tony Grant offered that all of these definitions indicate that the process of coaching is essentially about helping individuals regulate, and direct their interpersonal and intrapersonal resources in order to create purposeful and positive change in their personal or business lives. So from there, I think we can see that from a definitional perspective, from a purpose perspective, there's general consensus around what that broader purpose and process is of coaching. However, there are a variety of specific approaches and/or mechanisms that coaches employ to help their clients achieve desired outcomes. Just running through just quickly, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list, nor is it mutually exclusive, as you think about some of these potential mechanisms that people have written about. Eric DeHaan and colleagues have written quite a bit over the years about the importance of and methods of building the coaching relationship and how that plays a role. Others have talked about and written about the use of feedback, right, and the role that the coach should play in kind of providing clients with feedback of various forms and from various sources. David Drake has written quite a bit about over the years the use of stories, right, or working with narratives in helping clients kind of learn and grow through coaching. Others have written about kind of the physicality of coaching and kind of being aware of the body and using the body as a mechanism to help clients in the coaching process through embodied presence or somatic coaching. Yet others have focused on the importance of being aware of emotions in coaching, truly working with the client's emotions, and/or going beyond that, really leveraging emotions in the coaching process to drive desired outcomes. And then if you think about some of the work coming out of the University of Sydney and the coaching psychology, they really focus quite a bit on the psychomechanics of coaching. In other words, self-reflection, self-insight, well-being, and solution-focused approaches as key mechanisms to driving desired outcomes. Well, where I'm going to land today is on our approach and some of the mechanisms that we focused on here at the Weatherhead School at Case Western Reserve University. And this approach ties in and really kind of blends a number of the other mechanisms that I quickly went through there. So Here, we really focus on leveraging Richard Boyassas' intentional change theory and the work done by Richard and a number of other colleagues, myself included here at CASE, or people who come through here, as well as the neuroscience of change. And again, that work has been led, a lot of the neuroscience work by Tony Jack and colleagues, but others who have joined forces in really learning what we can from cognitive neuroscience and how that impacts not only the change process, but coaching in particular. Now, drawing on all this is an approach that we call coaching with compassion. Now, this approach to coaching draws on mechanisms to help a person or an individual being coached make progress on their intentional change efforts, right? Their efforts toward making truly sustained, desired change in their lives. Now, Boyassas and colleagues, or myself included again, have distinguished this from what we've referred to as coaching for compliance, right? Or coaching a person to some externally defined objective. And I'll talk in just a moment about what we've found through some of the research to be distinctions in these approaches and the resulting outcomes. Now, I will say before I move on that the coaching with compassion, as we describe it, has also been referred to in various research and other studies and writings as coaching for sustained desired change. It's been written about and talked about as coaching to the positive emotional attractor, which I'll talk about in just a moment here. Our Angie Passarelli, who's coming up here shortly, has written about it and studied it as vision-based coaching. And it's also been studied and written about as ICT, or intentional change theory-based coaching. And now all of these different forms that have been written about and studied still really fall under this umbrella of what we're calling coaching with compassion. And now 3 key principles of coaching with compassion that really are kind of embedded within each of those other approaches that I just shared are leveraging the power of positive emotion and recognizing how to leverage the tension between positive and negative emotion to facilitate change. Focusing on dreams, not just goals. And that's a key piece that we've found to be important in this coaching with compassion approach. So it's not just about goal setting and attainment of goals, but it's anchoring that or embedding that within the context of a broader set of dreams or personal vision. And then finally, focused on building resonant coaching relationships. So recognizing that the coaching relationship does indeed matter. Now, all 3 of these principles really flow from Boyassas' intentional change theory. And if you're not familiar with intentional change theory, I know many of you on this session or in this meeting are, but it recognizes that significant behavioral change is not necessarily a smooth linear process where you start at your starting point and smoothly progress to your end point of change, but instead significant behavioral change, according to the theory, occurs more in bursts or spurts that are labeled as epiphanies or discoveries. And what the theory suggests is that there are 5 of these bursts or spurts or epiphanies that need to occur for individuals to make sustained desired change. That starts with the discovery of one's ideal self, who one really wants to be and what they really want to do, and then progresses to a discovery of the real self, who one is today in an absolute, not just in an absolute sense, but who one is today relative to that defined ideal. And there are strengths, areas in which an individual is already in alignment between their real self and ideal self. But for most people, there are also gaps, areas where that real self and ideal self are not necessarily in sync or in alignment. That discovery then leads to the third discovery, which is the creation of a learning agenda or a plan to move the real self to where it is more closely aligned to the ideal. But this starts with, first of all, recognizing and then leveraging and building upon strengths, and then turning to closing any gaps that may exist. This is done through the fourth discovery, through the experimentation with and then practicing of new behaviors, again, to move a person closer to that desired end state or outcome. And finally, in the middle of all this is the recognition that significant behavior change is hard, as we know, and it's going to be more successful and likely if one does it within a network of trusting, supportive relationships. So building resonant relationships with others to help one travel through this change process. Now, so this theory of intentional change works at multiple levels, works as individual change, works at dyadic level, teams, groups, communities, and any kind of level of abstraction. But applied to the coaching practice or process, what happens is the coach is embedded within this fifth discovery in this change process, and essentially kind of helps a client travel through each of the 5 discoveries. Now, a driver for, and what much of the research that's been done around this model and really what makes it work derives from complexity theory and recognizes that there are positive and negative emotional attractors into which we might be drawn. And these things and these attractors have an impact on our ability to truly change and learn and grow. Now, within the positive emotional attractor, what's experienced is positive emotion, parasympathetic nervous system arousal. So an individual is more relaxed. Their peripheral vision is kind of at its maximum. They're actually capable in this state of making new neural connections and truly learning, growing, and changing in meaningful ways. Also, what happens within this positive emotional attractor is that from a neural network activation perspective, it's the empathic network that's activated. So individuals are more open to thinking creatively and being open to others and new ideas as they think about change. Now, in the negative emotional attractor, on the other hand, what's happening is from an emotional experience is they experience more of negative emotions. And from a neuroendocrine arousal perspective, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's more aroused. So the stress response. So individuals tighten up, blood flows from the brain to the large muscles in the body. So thinking is not as clear. You lose that capacity to truly make new neural connections and learn and grow and change in meaningful ways. And from a neural network activation perspective, it's the analytic network that's activated. So the focus is more on immediate, task performance or problem solving or solutions, as opposed to thinking more widely and openly about creative possibilities. So literally in this state, individuals are less capable of making change and learning as individuals are achieving that desired outcome ultimately in coaching, when they're embedded or anchored in that negative emotional attractor state. Now, this is not rigorous research here with, some, sophisticated methods and statistical analysis, but this that I'm going to share with you has yielded interesting insight nonetheless. And it has informed other research that we have been done and has been more rigorous. And now an exercise that we've conducted for many years is an exercise called Who Helped Me? And in that exercise, we ask individuals to think about someone who has truly helped them become the person they are today, truly helped them in their lives, right? And then to think about a particular moment when that person helped them. And then so we give them worksheets and have them think about this. So they write down the person and then the moment they really helped them. And then we also ask them to think about, well, what did they say or do right in that moment that was so helpful? And importantly, how did it make you feel, right? As you think about it, and what made it so helpful? And then we've often collected this exercise or these results in the context of a broader experience. So they also have been exposed to intentional change theory. So we asked them to jot down or note which phase of the intentional change process was triggered as well by that person. And then a second half of that exercise, we asked them to also think about, after they've captured moments from a number of people who have truly helped them, we asked them to think about, okay, now think about who has tried to help you over the course of your life and career, but perhaps wasn't as successful, right? So they tried to help, they meant well, but maybe it didn't really help. And then do the same thing. What were some moments you experienced? What did they say or do? How did it make you feel? What stages or phases of the intentional change process were triggered by that? And we collected that data. So we collected over a period of time all of these results, and something interesting emerged. So when we looked at what happened when people said that someone truly helped them, 80% of the time, or approximately 80% of the time, what was triggered was that positive emotional attractor and what they shared. About 20% of the time, it was a negative emotional attractor that was triggered. Again, so not 100% of the time, but 80% of the time, when individuals looked and thought about who really helped them in their lives, what they did put them in the zone of that positive emotional attractor. Now, interestingly, when you look at what individuals shared when they talked about who tried to help them, but maybe didn't, only 35% of the time did what that individual actually did to with them, put them in the zone of that positive emotional attractor. About 65% of the time, what that person did triggered the negative emotional attractor or the NEA instead, right? So 65% of the time. And this is interesting because I think it really explains to us or triggers some thought in terms of future research possibilities, which we've then followed up on. Is it's no wonder why so many efforts to help people change often fail, because many of the efforts that people are taking, meaning well, instead of really helping a person, they trigger that negative emotional attractor that puts them in that state where they're physiologically less capable of changing, learning, or growing. So many things often that including coaches, if they're not careful, might do are intended to be for good and to help an individual with the desired outcomes, but actually block the process instead. So a theoretical model we developed, and we put this forth back in 2012, that pulls a lot of this together, suggests that coaching with compassion, as we described it, really positively influences the experience or the triggering of the positive emotional attractor, which results in greater positive than negative emotion being experienced, as well as greater parasympathetic nervous system than sympathetic nervous system arousal. What's not depicted here in the model that we put forth in 2012, but that is part of this as well, is that it also activates the empathic network, we argue. And all of these things then lead to a variety of outcomes. Primarily, what we focused on the most is sustained desired change in the individual, right? But also the positive outcomes related to physical health and personal well-being. Now, coaching for compliance, that other piece that I haven't talked a lot about, but when you instead trigger that negative emotional attractor, helping people think about problems or as opposed to possibilities, for instance, negative emotions are more likely to be experienced. It's the sympathetic nervous system that's more highly aroused. And again, not depicted, but also within this coaching for compliance and the negative emotional attractor, it's the analytic network that's more likely to be activated. And these things, we argue, are going to be negative related to sustained desired change, as well as physical health and personal well-being. And then we've done a number of studies that kind of look at different parts of this model, if you will. Up in the upper right-hand corner, we also talked about things where we haven't done quite as much research. We've done some investigation and looking at this, but not as much research. But I think it's an opportunity, and that's what I'll get into as I wrap up my time here, is opportunities for future research and other ideas. But what that represents are when you have coaching with compassion that's taking place within an organizational context. So you have managers and leaders in organizations who begin to coach with compassion and truly create a culture of coaching with compassion in the organization. We argue that you're likely to see outcomes that are meaningful to the organization, such as organizational commitment of individuals, greater pro-social behavior, so organizational citizenship behavior, as well as higher quality connections amongst individuals in the organization. And I think it's important for future research that we begin to examine more outcomes such as these, because these are things that are truly meaningful and valuable to organizations. And it's organizations who are often, in the context of leadership development today and coaching today, paying for the coaching that many of our clients are experiencing. And they're often looking for, what's that payout? What's that benefit? What's the ROI? Well, I think beginning to explore more of these outcomes such as this will help in that regard. So quickly, yield my time here. Ideas or questions for future research, just a few, just thought starters about research or future research in this space. So my colleagues have done quite a bit of work on this coaching with compassion and coaching to positive emotional attractor versus negative emotional attractor using fMRI research, which has been fabulous and has yielded tremendous insight in terms of the process. However, fMRI research, as you may know, is very time consuming, it's very expensive, it's very invasive. So I guess one question is, what are some more potentially less invasive ways of examining the physiological effects of coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance? Now, we do have colleagues who have looked at other ways of doing this. Angie Passarelli in her work has used some other means. Anita Howard has done similar. But I think we still have a ways to go in coming up with ways of gathering this data that are truly less invasive and more affordable. Along those lines, you can ask what methods might be used to simultaneously measure these physiological effects, or things like heart rate variability, for instance, for both the coach and the person being coached or the client during a coaching conversation. Again, I think there is technology, there are methods of doing this, but again, to my knowledge, the things that I've seen are still pretty invasive. So it kind of detracts from the coaching conversation when you're all wired up and trying to do these things. So what methods might we be able to develop to kind of gather some of this physiological data in a very unintrusive way, such that it doesn't really detract from the coaching conversation and what's actually happening, and that allows us to really observe the dance of the coaching conversation between the coach and the client and see in the moment what's happening when the coach does this to the client, et cetera, and vice versa. Also, we've written quite a bit about over the years this distinction between coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance, and we've measured it in various ways. But we've never actually developed behavioral scales for these two forms of coaching. And I think doing so would open up the doors for a number of other investigations that can be conducted much more readily, just using kind of behavioral scales than some of the other techniques we've been using to measure these ways of coaching currently. Along those lines, it might help us further the research to really begin to determine, are coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance necessarily opposing approaches? We have often written about and talked about them in that way: coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance, good versus evil. And part of that is for emphasis, because we feel that there is an opportunity for more coaching with compassion, and the clients would benefit more if coaches and managers and leaders who do coaching would begin to think about that form of coaching more. But I think the question is, do they necessarily have to be opposite ends of the same continuum or spectrum? And I don't know that we know that for sure, and I don't think that that necessarily has to be the case. And along those lines, to what extent might coaching with compassion and coaching for compliance be used together to create sustained desired change for individuals? And under what circumstances? As well, under what conditions might one be more effective than the other? Again, we're strong proponents of coaching with compassion, but under what conditions might coaching for compliance actually be a way to more effectively reach desired outcomes for clients? I think there's also an opportunity for additional work on the dosage and sequencing effects of coaching to the positive emotional attractor versus the negative emotional attractor. We've done some work in that area, but I think there's room for a lot of additional work to see more and to build more of a body of work around that specific dosage and sequencing lines of thinking, if you will, in terms of what really makes a difference. And I talked about the mechanisms. I shared kind of the work going on and at the folks in Sydney in the coaching psychology unit. But to me, an interesting area to further explore would be what are the areas of convergence and divergence between intentional change theory-based coaching, or ICT-based coaching, and solution-focused cognitive behavioral coaching that has been focused on by the folks at the coaching psychology unit at Sydney. Shortly before he passed away, we had the opportunity, and several people on this call were in this session, to put together a session for the Academy of Management, where Tony Grant was one of the participants, and again, several people on this call were, but we, among other things, kind of put on the same stage Richard Boyassas to talk about all the years of work on intentional change theory and what that has led to in terms of knowledge about desired outcomes, and Tony Grant to talk about all the work coming out of Sydney around solution-focused cognitive behavioral coaching. It was an interesting display, a very useful conversation. And I think we started to have some discussion about, well, we should be talking more and blending that work. Unfortunately, Tony passed away and then COVID hit. So we really haven't advanced and moved forward on that. But as Richard said, you have these pockets of work being done all over the world. You kind of within these bubbles. What might we do to begin to kind of merge these bubbles more and cross-pollinate some of this work and learn from one another and learn kind of what some of the things we're doing are in alignment, and then teasing out some of the differences and what we might learn from those differences. And then finally, and this, I wanted to put this in there because Richard wanted to make sure that we address this as well. There's an opportunity for a comprehensive empirical examination of coach competencies that yield positive change in client outcomes. There still has not been a definitive research study comprehensively done that truly distinguishes and measures effective coach competencies, right? Now, there obviously are competency models that have been established and that we're working off of. But if you look at the work that was done to truly establish the competency movement, and Richard Boyassas is one of the founding fathers of the competency movement, in 82, his book, he suggested that for something to be a competency, it must be empirically tested or validated against performance or some desired outcome variable. It must be a specific behavior of a person, and it must actually distinguish outstanding performance versus average or poor performance, right, in the research. Now, we still don't have a study that's been conducted that truly teases that out for coaches, right? The work hasn't been done. Now, we have competency models, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, and Richard has talked about this for quite some time, but many of the things that we're talking about or calling competencies are not always competencies. Sometimes they're skills or job tasks or, some other things, but we still have work to do to really fully flush out an empirically validated coach competency model. Now, along those lines is, and Richard, I'll let you chime in here. So we have, if you'd like, so we'd like your help, or like to at least pull out a call for assistance, for help with the coaching competency study that we've had up and running. We're still gathering participants for this study, and it's been a slow go, unfortunately. But it's an aggressive study. So we really want to do what's really necessary to create a validated coach competency model. Richard, I don't know if you want to kind of jump in and kind of share what really is required. You're the principal investigator and you've been making this appeal, so I'll give you a chance to make an appeal to the group in a convincing way to hopefully get us some more participants.
Pretty much all of you have heard me talk about this, and Melvin and Ellen to some extent. And let me just leave it at, we need to be able to look at the competencies with a good longitudinal study against DVs of client change and of a comprehensive set of measures. I'm a little concerned about time. We had hoped to have plenty of time for the conversation by keeping each of the presentations to 15 minutes. So I'm not going to say any more at this point. Melvin, are you?
I'm done. Thank you. That's
okay.
It.
Well, what a great way to move to talking about the convergence of some of these ideas with the folks at Sydney and Michael. Why don't we just dive in?
I'll share my screen and we'll dive in. So it's lovely to be here, everyone. A bit like Melvin, I wasn't sure just how to go about doing this presentation. And I'm deeply uncomfortable with the idea of being thought of as a wisdom weaver. But I think together, because basically what I try and do is just ask questions. And I think together we can maybe weave some wisdom. But what I'll be largely doing in this presentation is asking some questions, and mostly about coaching competencies. So, as someone who's been involved in developing coaching competencies, what am I going to do? I'm going to have a quick and dirty review of the literature, and it's going to be very quick and very dirty. noticing some aspects of competency frameworks that are out there, and then look at what are the pros and cons of the whole competency framework world, and then finish off with some questions to ponder in our discussion later on. So I'll try and be very quick. So what's a competency? McClelland defined it as a personal characteristic, motive, behavior, skill, or knowledge that is proven to drive superior job performance. So the question becomes, what drives superior job performance in coaching? Well, what does the literature say? When I went through it to look at this, the empirical evidence for competencies is very, very weak, as Melvin has pointed out. I wasn't able to find a single experimental or randomized controlled study of coaching competencies. What I did find are a whole bunch of different frameworks and a different sort of qualitative studies, but really what they are is mostly at the level of collated opinion. You get a whole bunch of experts together and you say, well, what are the competencies? And then that becomes a competency framework. Yeah. Very rarely are there even studies that involve coaching clients. So here's an example. K.A. Horn in 2008 looked at 72 managers as coaches from the Eastern Cape in South Africa, and gave them a questionnaire asking them to rate which of these 11 competencies was most important for them. And this is what they came up with. Right? Now, no one could really argue with those as competencies. But what do they really mean? Maxwell in 2016 used a bigger sort of sample. He got a bunch of 17 experts to review 39 competencies using a modified Delphi model. And the experts reached consensus on 17 of those competencies in the first round. But the third round, 14 of the experts who were the ones left couldn't reach consensus on any of the remaining 22 competencies. And it's really interesting to look at some of those competencies that these people were sort of judging. These are the ones that they thought were genuine competencies, business experience. Sorry, can people read that? It gets even smaller later. Right? Working knowledge of coaching frameworks, self-confidence, trustworthiness, and so on. Right? But what about the ability to conduct a 360-degree review? Would you consider that to be a coaching competency? Or is that a 360 review competency? The ones they couldn't reach consensus on were things like formal training in psychology, experience as a business executive, experience facilitating organizational change, understanding of psychological theories. According to these people, that's not a coaching competency. Knowledge of personality, ability to apply models of human motivation. That's an interesting omission, isn't it? Yeah. Knowledge of adult learning theories and so on. When we look at the ICF or EMCC or other coaching frameworks, a lot of these things are in there. Okay, so what are some of the frameworks currently in use? I haven't included the Icf framework here because I assume most of you people know it, and I daren't start speaking to the Icf framework in front of all you Icf people. So EMCC, their framework, their competencies are seen in 6 levels, 2 of the foundation levels, 1 intermediate, 2 practitioner, and 1 master practitioner. And each level has the following groupings: competencies around beliefs and attitudes, competencies around self, communication skills, technical skills, and so on. Right? And this leads to quite a big competency framework. I haven't included it there. The one that I've been involved in developing is the Standards Australia Coaching and Organisations Competency Framework. And we break it up very differently. We look at generic coaching competencies and the supporting knowledge bases that are with them. And there are 4 types of skills within the generic coaching competencies. They're foundational micro skills, conceptual and technical skills. So foundational micro skills are things like questioning, reflective listening, etc. Being able to manage the coaching engagement. Conceptual and technical skills, these are things like case conceptualization, the ability to understand what's going on for people, ability to understand adult development and so on. Self-management and development skills, these are all about how you manage yourself within the coaching engagement and how you develop as a coach. And finally, boundary management skills, which are about managing the actual relationships associated in the coaching engagement. So that's the generic stuff, but we also go on to talk about different types of coaching that have additional skills associated with them. So in any given coaching engagement, you're likely to have at least 4 types of coaching. So coaching to develop skills. You might need to help a client develop a skill. And that has certain competencies associated with it, depending on the skills. Performance coaching, which is about using the skills that they have to be able to hit performance targets. Developmental coaching, which is about helping them take a different perspective on their world. And finally, remedial coaching. So the analogy that we use in the Standards Australia Handbook is of the cup. In skills coaching, we're getting something into the cup so it can be used. In performance coaching, we're using what's in the cup more effectively. In remedial coaching, we're helping the person fix cracks in the cup, things that are getting in the way. And finally, in developmental coaching, we're growing the size of the cup. So that's the Standards Australia approach. Here's an example of it. You don't need to read this, but that's the generic coaching competencies, 1 page of them. There's a couple of pages. And then these are the additional core competencies required for the different types of coaching. And of course, other types of coaching like transition coaching, etc., will have other core competencies. So what's the summary of all this? There's very little rigorously conducted research into what makes a competent coach. And that's worth pondering, I think. What's problematic about that, it provides little or no guidance for coach training. What do we teach coaches if we don't have really clear competency frameworks? But the other thing that I think is really important here, and this is the thing I'd like us to discuss most, is that all of the current frameworks have embedded in them a whole bunch of assumptions. Right? For instance, that coaching is about individual change. It's an interesting assumption, isn't it? That what changes is the individual. There are other models of change that work at the interpersonal level and also at the systemic level. And so do the competencies about change, about working with individuals for change, also hold when we talk about systemic coaching? The other thing that I think is going on in these different models is that it really replicates the fragmentation of the industry. That different groups have got different approaches to coaching and see coaching at different sort of levels, if you like. So I wonder, is that a good thing or is that not? So what's good about it it provides room for multiple understandings of coaching, that fragmentation. And it enables coaching to continue to adapt because it has so many different elements to it, to the ongoing needs of the modern world, if you like. See, one of the areas that I think is becoming more and more important is a movement away from just coaching individuals to enhance their performance towards helping organizations see the direction that they're moving and whether or not that's a useful thing for the world. It's also good that it does reflect the state of the industry. So, just to finish things off, what should research look like in this area? What assumptions are we bringing to the table about what coaching is and what it should be and how it works? And I think that would be a really interesting discussion for us to have. And then how do competency frameworks then shape the industry? Because all of these competency frameworks, they're stories that we tell ourselves about what it means to be a good coach. And like every story, some stories enable certain things to happen and they disable other things. So what do our stories, our competency frameworks enable and disable? What do they enable? What do they constrain? So that's about as quick as I can be, Richard.
That was fantastic, Michael. As somebody who I did my first empirical study of competencies against performance in 1970. I am exercising an unusual amount of self-control right now by not digging into all sorts of stats and opinions. And I'm going to ask a few of you to feed back some of that exercise of self-control to my wife so she can know I can do it, although I don't often. I'm going to leave it for our discussion to get into some of the particulars, but I love the way you were able to build on some of the fundamental questions that Melvin was asking too, and go in a way where you've been wrestling with this both from the empirical point of view as well as from the application point of view of what's usable and right down to the issue of how is diversity of thought possible. What I'd like to do to maximize the time for discussion is to dig right into Angie, your presentation. So
I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Michael. And Angie, if you could then take it from there.
Let me just get my screen share up here and launch the slideshow. Here we are. So, like you, Richard, having trouble with self-restraint and I want to dig into some of the conversations that have already been seeded. It's hard for me to switch gears to think about my own presentation. And so for those of you who are on the call with us, if you're feeling the same thing, I appreciate your regulation and shifting gears yet one more time. Today, what I'd like to talk about are the neurobiological mechanisms of coaching. And like Melvin's conundrum between a TED Talk or a traditional academic talk, I was having somewhat that same debate. And I think perhaps I fell a little more toward the technical side than did Melvin. So refill your coffee if you need to. Here we go. Oh, someone wonderfully said that you can see the wrong view. Here we are. How about this? Does that look correct?
Yes, you're great to go.
Fabulous, thank you. So as we look, or at least as I looked at the coaching literature, a good deal of existing research has begun to examine the mechanisms of coaching. Mechanisms are the factors that tell us something about how desired outcomes of coaching are achieved. And predominantly, these factors that exist in the literature are psychological in nature. They're about need fulfillment, self-efficacy, psychological capital, emotional intelligence, mindfulness. Sure, there are others, but they are really only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And underneath the surface exists this sort of sea of opportunity to really dig more deeply into what enables coaching processes to help people change and transform. And so one way of digging below the surface is to use neuroscience or psychophysiology to help to explore what the body can tell us about how positive change and transformation occur. So from our work, at a high level, we know that coaching conversations are moving to people, and that these conversations elicit a neurobiological response in the coachee. Those responses influence their emotion, cognition, motivation, behavior, and some of those things, and also influence the way they respond neurobiologically. We don't know as much empirically about the neurobiology of the coach and the dyad, but we do know that in order for coaches to be effective, they have to understand these implicit and often hidden dynamics to do their best work. Much of the existing empirical work that examines neurobiological mechanisms is anchored to intentional change theory, which you heard Melvin talk about in the first presentation. And so for my talk, I'd like to drill down more deeply into just the principle of emotional attractors. And you might notice a little bit of divergence from my thinking and Melvin's thinking on this. He mentioned the idea that there's this dichotomy set up of one is good, one is evil. In my view, this is not how emotional attractors work. Instead, they work in tandem, not necessarily in perfect balance, because I think you do need more experiences of PEA than NEA to experience this sustained positive change. But let me tell you a little bit more about emotional attractors, refresh your mind, your memory. The idea of emotional attractors is that these are psychophysiological states around which learning behavior is organized, and they stimulate movement through the process of intentional change. Both are necessary. We need experiences of the NEA at certain times in the process to help us focus, to help us make decisions, to help us set goals. But there are times when those can be maladaptive. And then there are times when being in the PEA can be maladaptive. So with these two little circles, the way I think about the PEA is that being in the PEA state, the positive emotional attractor state, we're enabling clients to aspire, to grow, and to thrive. And when our clients are in the NEA state, or our coachees, that state helps them to, or forces them to evaluate, to protect, and to survive. Melvin talked about this to some degree, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say that these two types of attractors, positive emotional attractors and negative emotional attractors, are associated with every aspect, every discovery in the intentional change process. And they tend to be quite pronounced in ideal self and real self discovery phases. So ideal self conversations help a person explore who they want to be, what they want to do in the future. And that activates this PEA state, whereas the real self tends to sometimes, especially when the coach is not highly adept, it tends to focus on weaknesses. How do I shore up weaknesses? 360 evaluation, goal setting, problem solving. And these activities activate the NEA state. So in most of the studies that I'll review and share today, these states have been experimentally induced by coaches who, operating as part of our research team, were told to focus either on the ideal self or the real self in their conversations with the participant based on random assignment. So what I'd like to do next is just share some of the common findings across a set of about 4 different studies that also, of course, draw on non-direct studies of coaching to inform some of the hypotheses, but these are 4 empirical studies that have been produced by myself and colleagues affiliated with the Coaching Research Lab at Case Western Reserve University. So probably the most robust finding across all of the studies is that the emotion is true to the PEA and NEA is true to its name. The PEA is emotionally uplifting. The NEA is somewhat mood dampening. And this has been found again and again. Based on pre and post self-report measures, participants felt better leaving a conversation around the ideal self that was meant to evoke the PEA than they did walking into it. And participants felt less uplifted, felt worse after the NEA than they did before it. But I need to say that even in the NEA condition, participants' overall affect was more positive than negative. In another study, linguistic analysis of transcriptions of coaching sessions showed that people in the NEA condition used more negative words. So that's consistent with the same finding of pre and post measures. But this study of the whole transcript also pointed to a much more sort of nuanced picture of fluctuations in emotional expression across the coaching session. So that could be a place where we do more research. And finally, the PEA in some of our fMRI studies, the PEA condition was associated with activation of brain areas that are associated with processing positive emotions. So we can say fairly confidently that emotions are a differentiator between these 2 states. Now, looking at some of our fMRI studies, or examining neuroimaging data or brain activity suggests that there are a number of other mechanisms at play, one of which is the activation of broad neural networks responsible for empathic and analytic reasoning. And Melvin also alluded to these. So to be specific, the PEA is associated with activation of the empathic or default mode network, which when the default mode network is activated, we have a mental frame that supports cognitive and emotional openness, social connectedness, and a sense of being connected to our morals and our values. On the other hand, the NEA is associated with activation of the analytic or task positive network, which inhibits empathic reasoning, and it focuses us on evaluation, logic, and task accomplishment. So ultimately, this line of research suggests that the coaching process can influence the coachee's frame of reasoning anchored to their neural architecture, which certainly is a mechanism that would have impact on coaching outcomes. Another mechanism that arose from our study of brain activity is visual attention. So whether we're seeing the forest or the trees. So across 2 fMRI studies, we found an overlap between how the participant attended to statements from their coach, who would coach them either in a PEA or NEA condition, and visual processing. So both the PEA and global attention tasks in these studies activated the visual associative areas. This is the part of the brain where we dream, where we put together the gestalt of an image, even if we don't have all the component parts. It's where we see the forest. There was also extensive overlap between the NEA coaching condition and local attention in the early visual areas that you see here in blue. You probably can't see me pointing to them on my screen. You see here in blue. And this is the part of the brain where we detect features and we see fine details, like seeing the trees. So again, this line of research suggests another neurobiological mechanism is how global and local attention can affect what coachees see in their mind's eye and what possibilities are available to them, whether they're focused on the forest or focused on the trees. And so a final place that we've looked to understand the neurobiological mechanisms of coaching is the autonomic nervous system. And myself and another colleague separately conducted studies where we used indirect measures of brain activity that tap into sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system activation. And with some conflicting results, I suppose. So theoretically, the PEA should be associated with greater influence of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the part of your nervous system that helps you rest and digest and recover from episodes of stress. The NEA would then be associated with greater influence of the sympathetic nervous system, which, as Melvin described, that's your fight or flight response that sends blood to your extremities and your muscles so you prepare to respond to a threatening situation. In both of the studies, there were no significant differences in any of the measures that we used: salivary cortisol, galvanic skin response, heart rate variability during the coaching session. And so separately, we both theorized that this could be due to just the social demands of interacting with another person. They're physiologically activating. So they may not be sort of emotionally stressful, but from a bodily perspective, the stress response that we could be seeing. And of course, it could be a measurement error. We're taking these measurements at the wrong time too. However, one of the studies looked at some of those measures in goal setting later. So after a coaching conversation ended, a client was engaged in sort of doing some of their own writing of goals. And there we saw the parasympathetic nervous system benefits accrue for those who were in the PEA condition, but not those who were in the NEA condition. So there's some indication that maybe these autonomic nervous system effects, particularly in terms of the parasympathetic nervous system, are beneficial a little bit after the coaching conversation ends. So we need more research in this area to really speak with confidence to what's going on from an autonomic perspective. So in summary, what I think the neurobiological mechanisms point to are a set of mechanisms that are under the surface, that underlie some of those psychological mechanisms that I presented at the beginning. And these are emotions, empathic versus analytic reasoning, visual attention, and processes related to stress arousal and renewal. In terms of future research, I think there are opportunities specific to intentional change theory to really tease out the role of temporal construal. So how important is it that people are thinking about the future versus thinking about the present or the past, and what effect does that have on what the client's resources are for change? I also think we need to embrace the complexity of these phenomenon, that we are highly complex individuals. We're never in just one state or the other, although the analytic and empathetic networks suppress one another. So in some ways you could say we're in one state or the other, but for such a small period of time. So I think future research really needs to embrace the complex nature of these phenomenon in the body and figure out, how do we look at toggling between states, recovery processes, and how does that apply to what we do inside the coaching session and what clients might do beyond the coaching sessions. And then of course, we need to replicate and extend the work that we've already done, and especially pay attention to what's happening for the coach, what's happening for the dyad, perhaps the coherence between the two, and also what's happening in other coaching configurations like peer coaching, team coaching, group coaching, because all of this work has been focused on sort of a traditional one-on-one coaching configuration. I think future research more generally needs to think about applying a neurobiological lens to some of the topics that are important in coaching today. So thinking about, how does this apply to coaching supervision? How does this apply to dynamics related to diversity, equity, inclusion? What can a neurobiological perspective tell us about dealing with burnout and post-traumatic growth in coaching? This one I think is particularly important. How do we take a neurobiological perspective on AI coaching? when a human isn't involved on one end with bots and apps? And how do we use it to explore ethical dimensions in coaching? So I think all of those are important to think about as we look to sort of the next generation of research on this. I also think it would be interesting to examine the impact of health behaviors like nutrition, hydration, sleep, exercise as either antecedents or moderators of some of these dynamics. And then, of course, there are coaching practices already that specifically address clients' neurobiology, practices like breath work, heart math, body scan, somatic coaching in general. And so these practices may be a place to delve into more broad understanding of these neurobiological mechanisms at play. So with that, I will conclude and move us toward conversation.
Thank you very much, Angie. I just wanted to point out that when Angie was talking about our work with the neural network activation, that work was all inspired and guided by Professor Tony Jack, who's on this call. And in fact, it's Tony's multiple decade long research on enhancing and refining and creating a research base for the task positive network and the default mode network, which he has very accurately relabeled the empathic network, in that order, the analytic network and the empathic network. So that labeling and the entire issue on the poles of reason. Tony, I'm going to give you a plug. We're looking forward to having Tony present in a future season of Future Coaching, but also quite possibly when his book looking at all of the research and the notion that Tony has made that these two networks are both forms of reason and really do enhance dual process theory. Not that we should publicly criticize Nobel Prize winners, but oh, what the hell. Anyway, Tony, I just wanted to emphasize that. Okay, we're moving along. These are fascinating things. I think it's important we get a chance to chat a little bit. So one of the things I want to do right now is we're going to go into breakout rooms for at least 10 minutes of, some initial reactions, and then we'll come back and have some plenary. Again, I reiterate, this is the first of 3 sessions. I assume in the future sessions, we'll continue these conversations. So, Sarah, if you can put us into the breakout rooms. Well, I'm sure for all of you, the closure was premature and abrupt. Kylie, we never had a chance to let you finish your last sentence or the sentence you were on. But I loved the point about equifinality. So what I want to do now is spend the next almost 30 minutes just opening it up. We're a whole bunch of scholars. We are hoping that we'll be a part of a series of conversations that do lead to greater wisdom and insight. But let me, just open it up. What do you think? Which of these ideas do you think you're looking forward to more work in the future? Which do you think are really pivotal? I think people should probably be inspired by our Canadian colleagues and try to be nice. So don't talk about which ideas are crap.
I'd love to hear Kylie finish a sentence on equifinality.
Okay. Go ahead, Kylie.
Because one of the things we talked about in our group is how in competency models and the psychomechanic type approach is that there's it's very much underpinned by a reductionist understanding. So equifinality as a complexity concept really fits in on that. So what were you saying, Kylie?
I was actually just speaking about the various different models, and maybe we should keep front and center that it's quite likely there are multiple paths to any given outcome, be it performance effectiveness or whatever it is that we're trying to understand. And it's actually quite likely that it's not going to be any one competency. It's likely to be different combinations of competencies. And that's, also depending on who you're coaching and then your own personal coaching competency. So it's a very complex picture. And I guess I'm questioning in my mind, on the one hand, the simplicity that a competency type approach brings is useful for regulating the field and getting rid of cowboys. On the other hand, from more of a scientific perspective of really understanding what's going on in terms of mechanisms, I'm just not sure we're ever going to get to a satisfying answer if we're just trying to identify one competency or one model that solves this complex process or explains it. That's what I was saying.
Gabby, thank you for.
More.
Sorry, Michael.
I said I couldn't agree more. I think that's actually a really important point.
No, and I'm looking forward to the next session, episode 2, next week on September 8th, where we'll have 3 people provoking us around ideas of what are the outcomes. Because as I said, in the competency research that I've been publishing against performance in my early stuff that I published in the 70s and 80s, was really focused on management. And we found that value-based or Delphi-based techniques identified 50% of competencies that were later validated against performance, a complex measure of 4 different aspects of performance, trying to differentiate what Luthen says, the difference between success versus effectiveness. We were focused on effectiveness, but that 25% of the things that people said were needed were irrelevant, and 25% were the opposite. So part of the desire to get us moving is to start to refine that. From my take on it, the problem that every of the certifying organizations invoke is they're trying to do too much. They're trying to say, what's the minimum entry requirement, which in my research since the 70s, I've talked about as the threshold. You know, what knowledge do you need? What basic skill competency to get average or to be mediocre? But then to say, what are also the distinguishing ones, the ones that can make you truly effective? Because from my vantage point, what I've seen is we really want to be able to screen for inclusion, a minimum set of standards, but then we want to train to and develop things that actually predict effectiveness. So anyway, just.
It's the notion of equifinality that led me to come up with the development pipeline, which looks at the necessary conditions, and then there are multiple ways to activate them. So I do a talk on 20 ways to cultivate insight. You can create insight by insulting somebody, or just doing nothing, or by saying, oh, look at that, or asking questions, and by saying, well, who are your role models? So there's so many different ways to get there, but the desired goal is insight on what really matters to that person and what they can do about it. And so how do you activate motivation? But motivation is the necessary condition for change. And so thinking about what are we trying to build in the client rather than what does the coach do, because there's so many things coaches can do. And second, I think the journey from new coach to good coach really depends on competencies, but going from good to great needs to shift to how do we establish the desired outcomes using a broader repertoire of skills and tools and frameworks.
Thanks, David. Well said. Other thoughts, observations?
I hear something. Sorry, Michael.
No, go on, Nikki, you go.
Something I'm curious about. Coaching as an emerging profession and a discipline, we lean heavily on, we borrow from other disciplines such as psychology and counseling and things like that. So, and I don't have a psychology background, but maybe someone in the audience who is trained in psychology or know about psychology research, what have they done in terms of this? Have they asked the same question? Are there competency frameworks for psychologists and counselors? Because surely we don't have to reinvent the wheel if other people have thought about this as well. So it's a question to the audience.
I think it's quite profound, Nikki. When I was in training as a clinical psychologist, because I did a certain amount of therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts in the 70s, one of the things that was hammered home in the late 60s, and then as we entered into the 70s, was Isink's study in the National Health System in England, where he showed that people who were on the waiting list for one of the various talking cures, the psychotherapy, improved as much as the people who had 1 year of psychotherapy. So it is a humbling piece of data to remind oneself regularly about. For me, a lot of that comes back to the issue of outcomes. And as several of the presenters talked about, what we're trying to do with the coaching varies. And right now, like psychotherapy or like teaching or like healthcare, any of the helping professions, I think coaches are very often put in a position of trying to help individuals, teams, organizations, and as several of the presenters suggested, what are we doing for larger communities and countries and societies?
I also think
some of the, sorry, get on, Sandra.
I just wanted to say that I think Nikki has made a good point with regard to looking at other professions. I think it's also important for us to differentiate coaching from other professions and say, okay, we are not a mentor or trainer, or at least when we go into that role, we know that we are training right now and not coaching or mentoring, and really have coaching as a single profession and not try to do everything, because right now it feels like we have to have every competence, a leader, coach, trainer, mentor, like have every competence. That's, I think, quite impossible.
Yeah, this has been a topic that's exercised my mind a lot. What are the boundaries between these different types of interventions? Are there actually boundaries? I mean, a lot of the techniques that we use in coaching, we borrow directly from therapy. And coming back to Nikki's question about what has been learnt by psychology about this, well, the biggest finding is that the therapeutic relationship is what predicts outcome most. And all of these sort of, competency frameworks aren't that predictive. So the question in my mind around that, it goes back to this idea of equifinality. There was a study done on what makes a great leader. And we try and identify what leadership qualities leaders should have. And I just remember thinking about Patch Adams. He wouldn't show up on any of the, great pediatrician lists. And you wouldn't want everyone acting like Patch Adams, right? Because there's actually multiple ways to be a great leader.
No, I think that pluralism of capability and how we blend it together to deliver our thing ends up being very, very important. I know when I was training coaches in the 70s and into the 80s, I used to, because I was also doing psychotherapy, but I was having to differentiate them carefully. So I would say to the coaches, stay away from talking about sex, politics, or people's parents. And it's not, it's a little facetious to say it that simply, but my guess is it's not going to be that hard to talk about how big parts of the profession separate. With Belrose Raggins and Kathy Cram, who did this marvelous handbook of mentoring and have both been prime movers in the mentoring research, I have a standing argument with them. I think mentoring is a subset of coaching. And I think that when people are coaching, sometimes they slip into mentoring, and that's not bad. But a lot of people who are quote unquote mentors would be a lot more effective if they were also coaches. So I don't know. I'm offering Sandra this as I think the issue of where we put the role boundaries is one of these questions that we have to spend more time studying.
Can I just answer something? Somewhere it was, I think Jack asked this question about competencies versus capabilities. And we wrote this paper in 2015 exactly under this title, and argued quite seriously about the competencies approach in relation to coaching. And I still want to, I still have the same view on that we are oversimplifying our profession, because the competencies approach are quite appropriate for manual type of jobs, for the things that are really simple and can be pretty altogether agreed what we should do. If we are dealing with the complexity of individuals, if we are dealing with the complexity of our context in which we work, and the complexity of all the processes, competencies approach is too simple. So I just think we probably need to review that, the whole position in relation to them, and think about them as initial skills that allows people to start practicing, but then apply more capabilities approach, which put the onus on the self of the practitioner and what they can do and how they can be more congruent to who they are. In this case, they become as more versatile, as more kind of interesting and developed practitioners as they can be.
I think that's great, Tatjana. And not just about who they are, but also how do they work and co-create an engagement with the person.
Yeah, and Tatiana, I remember when I was doing a lot of work on in the UK, when the certification of managers movement started, I was actually arguing both sides. It was a good thing, but it was a bad thing. And part of it was I had to change the label. So what I call competencies in the UK is called capabilities. When I was working in Italia durante il novanta, I was using capacità. It goes competenze is the wrong word. So part of it is, I think too often people have reduced what I value as this complex notion like empathy of a competency capability to a proficiency. And that's when the amount of reductionism, I think, diminishes how people can deploy it. Other observations?
I just want to say goodbye because I need to leave. But I also don't know if you all know about the incredible gift that the Institute has partnered with ICF. Magda, do you want to just give a sentence or two about that before I have to run?
Certainly. Thank you, Carol, and hello, everybody. We are extremely happy and feeling privileged and very excited that we partner with the Institute of Coaching for their grants program. So ICF pledged $575,000 over the next 5 years to work hand in hand with the Institute, with Carol, with Angela, and many other colleagues there. So, so we can indeed, with the input from forums like this, to seek the new research in the areas that we find important to further and to add to the growing body of knowledge around the science of coaching. So very excited about this partnership with the Institute, and thank you, Carol.
And for those of you
working with your graduate students, etc., be thinking about grants. And Angela, I don't know that you all know, she is our director of research. So it's a beautiful cycle, because Richard, you shared that when you were at the Institute, you got the idea for the coaching lab, and now you're giving us Angela. So we are very happy.
And Angie's thesis was only possible by a grant from IOC. Otherwise, the equipment that she had to buy and the training she had to get would have been too expensive.
So exactly. So if any of you are interested or thinking about this already, we are putting together systems to support the application process as we speak. We'll begin accepting pre-proposals in a few months, probably November. I don't have a specific date, but it will be this year. And our first full proposal review will be in February. So that is February of 2022. So mark your calendars. Keep me busy.
Fantastic.
Okay, some others would like to offer some other observations.
Well, I just want to pick up on Kylie's thought on complexity and how that, and it also goes back to what Melvin was suggesting as far as methods and thinking about the methods that are being used and looking at the methods in the research as far as are the methods really keeping up with the complexity understanding that we're, opening up to, because there is just a lot of different nuances, and are the methods that we're using able to tease out. I love what Angela talked about, the toggling states, and then Michael talked about our assumptions, right? And so thinking about digging into the assumptions under the methods and what that looks like. So just an opportunity to really reflect on our methods in the field.
Thank you, Alicia. In our group, we thought that coaching, and maybe coaching psychology, is at an important moment of change, and that's what those presentations made us think. And here in the UK, the British Psychological Society has recognized coaching psychology as a division. That's a huge achievement, I think, for all of us. And particularly, I want to acknowledge Professor Tony Grant. He was one of the kind of the leading figures in doing that. And so I'm excited by the idea that we can all talk in this way. So I'm very grateful to everyone on this call. And one question I've had, though, just a kind of a big question, is, if we were to pause all coaching from now for 10 years, we just stop doing this, I'm kind of curious, what would be different 10 years from now? What is it that coaching, what are we suggesting that if we do coaching and we do it better and we understand it better, what's going to be different? Is the world going to be better 10 years from now because of what we're doing? And that's kind of the big question that's kind of emerged for me while we've been chatting.
My initial reaction is that if we don't do coaching in a compassionate, caring way, we're inevitably going to deteriorate to the world of Mad Max, to a dystopian future where people's relationships aren't building on each other, but in fact, demolishing each other.
So, Richard, that I think raises a very interesting question. To what degree is coaching complicit in creating the world of Mad Max as we sit here?
Right. I mean, I remember Richard Hackman, our professor and friend of many of us from formerly Yale and then Harvard, used to always say in a situation like this, under what conditions would this approach to coaching be helpful and effective? Under what conditions would this other? And I think your notion, Michael, about bringing these assumptions up to the surface, it ends up being very, very important, which is why I think this conversation next time about the desired outcomes is imperative.
I often think about coaching a bit like Thelma and Louise. There they are in the car heading towards the cliff. Where's the coach? And the coach is down in the footwell helping Thelma press the accelerator.
Yeah.
So
well,
I think we could lift our view a bit around coaching.
I get into this a lot when people push from corporate settings where, whether they're an internal or external coach, they're feeling that people have to, in those settings, solve the problem or fix the person or get them to fit into the corporate culture. If anything, what Angela was talking about, and to some extent Melvin is talking about, is that when you're narrowly problem focused or you're too specific goal driven, you actually close the human mind down.
Yeah.
So right now, I would say the complicity sometimes is in the contracting process. And is your obligation as a coach to the individual, or is it to the person who's paying? And if you can't reconcile that in some way, it's tough. It's going to be a very difficult way this all happens.
Or is your obligation to a greater set of values than either the individual or the organization?
That's right. I mean, in Melvin Ellen's and my book that came out last year, which we focused on coaching as one of the many forms of helping and a model for all helping. We actually ended the last chapter by saying we live in a world in which in every society narcissism is rampant. And I mean, like, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? And yet, quite possibly, the only antidote is to have people step outside of themselves and care for others. And what more marvelous way to do that than with the concept of reaching out and helping others in terms of their life. Now, I saw a few other people that seemed like they wanted to say something. Scott, you were motioning.
Yeah, so I'll just make an observation and then a word of encouragement to the group, given the nature of the discussion. The observation is my colleague, and many of you know him, Edward Pally at the Naval Postgraduate School, has been studying when an IED, an improvised explosive device, goes off. What is the reaction of the people that are affected, that are immediately on the scene? Who do they turn to lead them, if you will? Who do they turn to in that instant? Now, the military's probably spent more money on development than any other organization I can think of historically. And yet, in that moment, what he has found is they don't turn to the file leader, the one designated, if you will, the coach to be. They actually turn to the person who they think cares for them the most. I find that stunning. Now, when things get settled down and we've kind of reacted, then they turn to the file leader for future direction, organization. But in the moment of pure chaos and complexity and trauma, they don't turn to that person unless that individual is one that they believe cares about them deeply. By way of observation or encouragement, many years ago, Stephen Covey, Terry Warner, some other notable scholars at Brigham Young University, when Covey was on the faculty there, decided they wanted to create a theory of human development. And so they set aside 2 hours a week, and for 4 years they worked at it and came up with nothing in terms of an overall grand theory. And yet from those conversations emerged what Stephen Covey has done, Terry Warner's done a more amazing work as well, and others. So the objective wasn't accomplished, but the work that came out of those conversations and interactions was extraordinary and changing. Alan Bergen, for example, created within the APA the spirituality and religious division. He was part of that group. And so I'm excited about this group and what can emerge. We may not solve all the answers to coaching, but we certainly will probably have very generative outcomes, individually and collectively.
Thank you, Scott. Morel, you motioned that you wanted to say something.
Well, just an encouragement for the weaving purpose is one thing I learned studying dialogues in Africa was to listen to every voice. The one thing I would encourage for next time is really get diversity, bring out every voice in the room and harvest it for its wisdom. And then there's a possibility of discovering from the small signals and the edges of the system. So just an encouragement going forward.
Thank you for that, Morel. We are going to have 2 more sessions with the same group of people. So there's plenty more opportunity in each of the next 2 Wednesdays for us to build on these ideas. The provocateurs, if you will, the presenters next week include Eric DeHaan from Ashridge and Hilt University, Ellen Van Oosten from Case Western Reserve and the Coaching Research Lab, and Jonathan Pasmore from the Henley Business School, specifically focused on outcomes, but we're also building. So I expect us to carry forward things we are observing from today's session into next week. As always, for me, a measure of a session is, would we love to have gone on longer? I certainly feel like I wish we had, but we have next week. So tune in next week, next Wednesday, 4 to 6 p.m. Boston time. And then the following week, it'll be 10 p.m. to midnight Boston time, which is more reasonable for those of you in Asia. Again, thank you very much for both the ideas and for your participation.